Hi guys, today I want to talk about something that's the opposite of what we usually talk about, which is we usually say when it's important to recognize when challenges are actually wins. Meaning, when we see challenges with our kids that are new, sometimes it's really important to recognize that those challenges are actually really big windows into a developing brain, and that's a win, that's a good thing. It doesn't mean it's always easy. For example, when a child is going through development and they start to move into a more sophisticated form of development, at about between 1 and 2, they start touching everything, right? So they move into a more movement, touch, tactile way of processing their tools. That's way more sophisticated than more primitive brain functions of processing. So we move into a more sophisticated way to process, which would be more movement touch driven. And so they're engaging more in movement touch. They're moving around, they're touching things, and that can be really challenging. They're putting things in their mouth more. That's actually really good. It's a window into the brain. It's a stage of development that needs to happen. We need to let it happen. We need to encourage it. We need to stimulate it. We need to not just shut it down. We need to keep it safe and within reason, but it's an important developmental stage based on where a child or a person is. Now, sometimes they don't get there until they're a little bit older. So that it's important for us to understand that every behavior tells us something about how we're processing and about the brain, and that there's a reason for behaviors. Now, that can come in a lot of different forms. Sometimes we talk about that pushback you get at about 3 to 4, meaning I'm starting to have more awareness outside of myself and I'm starting to push back. That's actually a really important developmental stage as well. That looks like a challenge, but is actually a win. Sometimes we have 14, 15, 20-year-olds that haven't gone through that yet, and they just look like the super compliant child, and they have some other challenges, anxiety, processing, executive function, and we start working with them, and then they start pushing back as we start to have growth. Well, that's actually a really big win. It's not easy, but it's a win because it's a window into the brain, that the brain is changing, and that's good. Today, I want to talk about when a challenge, or when a win, we think it's a win, but it's actually a challenge. And that is, I have a perfect example of this. So in this scenario, we have a child who's a little delayed in gross motor function, a little late in talking, just kind of a little bit delayed in the overall trajectory of the way that this child is neurologically moving through development. But going okay. And then this child enters kindergarten. So they go to kindergarten, go to the classroom, and now all of a sudden we're a little delayed and we have an increased demand, because all of a sudden we have an increased visual cognitive demand. All of a sudden we have this increased demand of now we need to sit and we need to learn letters and do more abstract and we need to learn socialization. So all of a sudden the life demand of this individual went from maybe here to like here. The demand of processing in all these different realms, social, academic, cognitively, behaviorally, all these areas. But the tools were here and maybe even like here. And so we start to see, when we see a gap in the tools that we have and the demand, we see deflections, we see deflective behaviors. Now, maybe that looks like pulling in. In this scenario, let's say that looks like acting out, aggression, anger, getting super frustrated, hitting, biting, and we start to see those things in the classroom and at home. Well, that's a problem. Everybody knows that's a problem. And so we work through that by coping and doing things in the classroom and whatnot. We would work through that differently. And my recommendation would be we understand what's happening there and we work to get this child up to speed with development so that the tools meet demand. But what we do is we see that's happening. Now, what happens is that this child in this scenario starts coming up with ways, compensatory ways, to process their world, so to meet the demand. And what they do is they start becoming very, very particular about how they do everything. They start to try to control, because there's this gap. I don't have the tools to efficiently process this demand or meet this demand, so I'm going to try everything I can to control my environment, control how I hold my pen, how I hold my pencil, my fine motor, my gross motor, control my friends, control what we play, control how we interact, control when we go to school and when we leave, control what we do when we get home, control what happens in the classroom, control how the paper is sitting on the table, and if it gets wrinkled, that's a problem. And the problem with that is it looks like we're doing better because we're not having as much of the anger, reactivity, that stuff. But what's actually happened is we've just learned this deflective strategy of I'm going to reduce the complexity of my world by trying to control it. And then what happens is we have very little cognitive flexibility. We still do not have tools that meet the demand. We've just figured out ways to deflect and do our life differently. And then what happens is you have the child that can maybe hold it together, not biting and acting out as much at school anymore. However, now what's happening is maybe holding it together all day, going home and acting out at home, having a huge meltdown at home, or being really, really sad at home, or just not being able to keep it together, just complete meltdowns at home emotionally in some of those ways. Sensory sensitivities, you can't wear different clothes, that kind of stuff. It cannot handle different environments or different sensory input, just tries to hold it together all the time. And so what we see is that also anxiety over anything different, anything change, any new environment goes way up. So what happens is maybe the behavior that looked like it got better, the behavioral outburst got better, but it's interesting, now I have this anxiety and then kind of meltdowns at home. Well, those things are not separate. Those are together. We have to understand that one has created the other because we've just continued on this path and we haven't actually addressed the underlying problem. So that is what we are talking about in this different variation on when it looks like a win, but it's actually a challenge. Remember, it's very important for us to understand what the behaviors are telling us about how an individual is processing and where their gaps may be in development, and then we can really make a change, both parenting, clinically, educationally, and connection-wise. Remember, there are no purposeless behaviors.